It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Willow Ridge. The kind of afternoon where nothing much happens, and that's exactly how people liked it. The sun hung lazily in the sky, its rays warming the cracked pavement outside Dave's auto repair. Inside the garage, the air smelled like oil, metal, and hard work, things Dave Dawson knew well. The sound of wrenches clicking and engines humming filled the shop. Dave worked quietly, as he always did. He was a man of few words, focused and steady, his hands moving with the confidence of years spent fixing things other people couldn't. The little bell above the door occasionally jingled when a customer stepped in. Mrs. McCarthy had stopped by earlier to pick up her car. She'd brought a fresh baked pie as thanks. It sat on the workbench, untouched for now. Dave didn't care much for noise or fuss. His life was simple, and he liked it that way. He was tall but lean, with broad shoulders that spoke of years spent lifting engines and hauling tools. His hair, once dark, was now peppered with gray. His face was lined from long days in the sun and nights under harsh garage lights. People didn't always notice him, at least not right away. Dave was the kind of man who faded into the background, his quiet nature making him easy to overlook. But that was just how he liked it. Dave stood near the counter, wiping his grease-stained hands with an old rag. The garage door was half open, letting a cool breeze roll in. He could hear the faint chirping of birds outside and the occasional hum of a car passing by on the main road. A peaceful day, as usual. Until it wasn't. The calm was shattered by a sound that made Dave look up. Motorcycles. The low, growling roar of engines echoed through the small town like a distant storm. Dave stepped closer to the open garage door, squinting out toward the street. And there they were, at least a dozen of them. Motorcycles gleaming under the sun, their chrome parts catching the light like sharp knives. They weren't riding casually. They stormed down the road in a tight formation, like wolves hunting in a pack. The sound grew louder as they neared, rattling windows and turning heads. Townsfolk peeked out from behind curtains or stepped off sidewalks to watch the group roll in. Willow Ridge was a quiet town, and people here didn't like trouble. That's why, when the motorcycles pulled into Dave's auto repair, a few of the neighbors across the street took notice. A curtain twitched. Someone whispered to someone else. The bikers' arrival felt like a dark cloud settling over the sunny afternoon. The bikes came to a stop in the shop's parking lot, engines sputtering to a halt. Then came the silence, the kind that feels heavy and sharp, like the air before a storm. The leader stepped off his motorcycle first. His name was Blade. No one knew his real name, and no one cared to ask. Blade was the kind of man people avoided, his reputation riding ahead of him like an invisible warning sign. He was tall, taller than Dave, and built like a bear. His leather jacket was worn and patched, covered in logos and symbols most people didn't recognize. Tattoos crawled up his arms and neck, some bold and black, others faded with age. His face was rough, carved with lines of anger and age, and his eyes were dark, sharp as broken glass. Blade didn't just walk, he loomed. Each step he took toward the garage felt heavy, like he was daring someone to stop him. The other bikers followed, parking their motorcycles in messy rows. They climbed off one by one, laughing and talking loudly. They all wore the same black leather jackets, heavy boots, and scowls. Some were younger, others older, but all of them had that same edge, the look of men who lived by their own rules. Blade was the first to speak. "You the mechanic here," he said, his voice a low growl that carried easily across the shop. Dave didn't flinch. He stood behind the counter, still wiping his hands with that same old rag. He didn't need to look up to know trouble when it walked in. "Yeah," Dave replied, his voice calm and steady. "This is my shop." Blade's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was more like a sneer, like he already knew he was going to get what he wanted. "Good," Blade said, pointing a thumb back at his motorcycle. "Fix my ride. It's acting up, and I don't have time for your slow town nonsense. Do it quick, or there'll be trouble. Dave looked up then. His eyes met Blade's, calm but unblinking. He didn't look scared, though most people probably would have been. The silence stretched between them for a moment, long enough for a bead of sweat to roll down one of the younger bikers' faces. Dave tilted his head slightly, still wiping his hands. "We'll see about that," he said. His voice was quiet, almost polite, but there was something else in it, a hint of steel beneath the calm. Blade didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he didn't care. He turned back to his crew, laughing loudly. The other bikers joined in, their voices booming through the shop like they'd already claimed it. They leaned on their bikes, kicked at the gravel, and passed cigarettes around. One of them, a wiry guy with a scar on his cheek, snatched a wrench off the workbench and twirled it between his fingers. "Nice place you got here, old man," he said with a smirk. "Real cozy." Dave ignored him. He'd seen men like this before, loud, full of themselves, trying too hard to look tough. He didn't need to respond. He just stepped around the counter and walked toward Blade's motorcycle, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who knew what he was doing. The bike was big and heavy, built for someone like Blade. It was custom painted black with red flames licking up the sides of the tank. The engine, though powerful, had a faint ticking noise that didn't sound right. Dave crouched down next to it, his sharp eyes already picking up on the problem. The bikers kept talking as he worked, their voices a low, constant rumble in the background. "What do you think, Blade?" one of them said, loud enough for Dave to hear. "Think the old guy can even fix it?" Blade laughed again. It wasn't a friendly sound. "He better," Blade said, folding his arms across his chest. "Or he'll regret it." Dave didn't look up. He didn't say anything. He just kept working, his hands moving quickly and smoothly. A few tools clinked softly against the concrete floor, but that was all. The bikers might have been loud and menacing, but Dave acted like they weren't even there. And that only seemed to make them madder. The wiry guy with the scar wandered closer, still twirling that wrench. He leaned down, his face close to Dave's. "You deaf or something, old man? My buddy asked you a question." Dave paused. He didn't look up right away, just set down his wrench and wiped his hands again. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked the younger biker straight in the eye. "I heard him," Dave said quietly. For a second, the shop fell silent. The biker blinked, startled by how steady Dave's voice was. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something smart, but no words came. Dave turned back to the bike, picking up his tools again. Blade watched the exchange from a few steps back, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. Maybe he was starting to see that Dave wasn't as easy to rattle as he'd thought. "Quit messin' around," Blade barked at his crew. "Let the guy work. We don't have all day." The other bikers muttered their agreement, falling quiet for the moment. But even as the noise died down, something hung heavy in the air, a feeling, sharp as a knife. It wasn't just another job. It wasn't just another day. And Dave knew it. Dave kept his focus on the motorcycle, his hands steady as he worked. It was a classic Harley, customized and powerful, but it had seen better days. The ticking sound in the engine told him someone had done sloppy work on it before. Whoever it was hadn't cared much about getting it right. As Dave worked, Blade stepped closer, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He loomed over Dave, watching with sharp eyes. The man wasn't used to waiting, and his patience was already wearing thin. "You've been quiet, old man," Blade said, his voice low but menacing. "Makes me wonder if you know what you're doing at all." Dave didn't look up. He tightened a bolt, checked the chain, and then finally spoke, his voice calm as ever. "You brought it to me, didn't you?" Blade's lip curled, like he didn't like being reminded of that fact. One of the younger bikers snorted, but Blade shot him a look that shut him up fast. Blade turned his gaze back to Dave, as if sizing him up again. "You'd better not waste my time," Blade said. Dave didn't respond. He didn't need to. His focus was on the bike, not the man throwing threats at him. The truth was, Dave had seen plenty of men like Blade in his lifetime, loud, aggressive, all bark and, sometimes, a little bite. But Dave wasn't the kind of man to rattle easily. Still, he wasn't stupid either. He knew exactly what kind of people he was dealing with. He'd seen their type before, guys who rolled into quiet towns, kicked up dust, and made trouble just because they could. Blade and his crew weren't here to play nice. They'd come looking for something or someone to push around. Inside the shop, the atmosphere had shifted. The quiet calm of earlier was gone, replaced by an uneasy tension that hung in the air like smoke. Even the faint sounds of birds outside seemed to have disappeared, as if nature itself could sense the change. The bikers continued to spread out across the lot, making themselves at home where they didn't belong. One of them leaned against an old car Dave had been fixing earlier, his boots scuffing the paint. Another rummaged through a box of spare parts sitting near the garage door, tossing pieces aside like they were junk. "Hey," Dave said without looking up. "Leave those parts alone." The biker holding the box froze for a second. He glanced toward Blade, as if checking to see if he needed permission to listen to Dave. Blade gave a small shrug, amused more than anything. "Put the box down," Blade said with a smirk. "We're not here to rob the place. Yet." The biker chuckled and dropped the box onto the concrete with a loud clang. Dave didn't flinch, but he filed that away. These weren't just punks, these were men who wanted to test limits, see how far they could push. Dave sighed softly and turned his attention back to the motorcycle. He was almost finished with his inspection. It wasn't a big issue, nothing he couldn't handle, but it would take a bit of work. And the sooner he got Blade and his crew out of his lot, the better. "What's the problem?" Blade asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. Dave stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his rag again. He met Blade's gaze evenly. "Loose timing chain," Dave said. "It's slipping, causing that tick in the engine. Could have been worse if you kept riding it." Blade's eyebrows twitched. For a second, Dave thought the man might argue with him. But Blade just nodded and crossed his arms. "So fix it," Blade said. Dave glanced at the bike again and then back at Blade. "It'll take an hour or two," Dave said simply. "You can wait here or come back later." The younger bikers groaned loudly at the thought of waiting. One of them, a tall guy with a long ponytail and a broken tooth, stepped forward. "An hour? We don't got time for that, man," he shouted. Dave didn't react to the outburst. He just looked at the man calmly, his expression unreadable. "Rushing won't fix the bike," Dave said evenly. "You want it done right or done fast." Ponytail looked like he wanted to argue, but Blade held up a hand to stop him. Blade wasn't stupid. He knew enough about bikes to know that Dave was telling the truth. "Fine," Blade said, his voice low and sharp. "But make it fast." Dave didn't respond. He simply turned back to his workbench and picked up the tools he'd need to get started. The bikers, meanwhile, started making themselves comfortable in the lot. Ponytail lit a cigarette, leaning back against the hood of a pickup truck parked nearby. The guy with the scarred cheek, who Dave was already starting to dislike, wandered over to the garage door again, kicking at tools and parts as he went. The others pulled out beers, cracking the cans open with loud hisses that echoed in the quiet town. Dave ignored them as best as he could. He'd dealt with rowdy customers before, though none quite like this. As he worked, he kept his movements slow and steady, his mind clear. He wasn't in a rush. If Blade and his crew wanted to act like they owned the place, that was their business. But Dave. He wasn't about to let them rattle him. Minutes ticked by. The sound of the bikers laughing and talking filled the air, but Dave tuned them out. He focused on the bike, his hands moving with the practiced skill of someone who knew machines better than most people knew themselves. "Hey, old man," one of the bikers called suddenly. Dave glanced up, raising an eyebrow. Scarface stood just inside the garage, holding a shiny wrench in his hand. He spun it around lazily, a smirk playing on his lips. "This yours?" Scarface asked, holding up the wrench like it was some kind of prize. Dave's eyes narrowed slightly. "Put it back where you found it," he said, his tone calm but firm. Scarface's grin widened, like he'd just been challenged. He twirled the wrench again, this time letting it slip through his fingers. It hit the ground with a loud clang, rolling across the concrete floor. Dave didn't say a word. He just looked at Scarface, his expression unreadable. The younger man faltered slightly, shifting on his feet as if suddenly uncomfortable. Blade, who had been watching the interaction, let out a low chuckle. "Careful, Scar," Blade said, his voice dripping with amusement. "Wouldn't want the old man to get mad." Scarface laughed nervously and backed away, muttering something under his breath. Dave went back to work without another word, but in his mind, he'd already taken note of Scarface. Trouble often came in the form of men who didn't know when to quit, and Scarface fit that mold perfectly. Outside, the sun had started to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lot. The golden light made the bikers' chrome motorcycles gleam, but it also made their presence seem even darker, like shadows stretching across the town. Blade wandered over to his bike, watching Dave work. "You're taking your time," Blade said, his voice low. Dave didn't look up. "I'm doing it right," Dave said simply. Blade stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Good," Blade said. "Because if you screw this up, you'll wish you hadn't." Dave didn't respond. He didn't need to. Blade lingered for a second longer before turning away, barking orders at his crew. The bikers started laughing again, their voices carrying through the quiet town like thunder. Dave tightened the last bolt on the bike and straightened up, wiping his hands on the rag for what felt like the 100th time. The engine was ready, fixed and running better than it had in years. He looked toward Blade, who was now standing by the pickup truck, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Bike's done," Dave called. Blade turned, his dark eyes narrowing. He didn't say anything at first, just walked slowly toward the motorcycle. The other bikers followed, their voices falling silent as they watched Blade approach. Blade stopped in front of the bike and looked it over, his expression impossible to read. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill, tossing it onto the workbench without a word. "Good work, old man," Blade said finally. Dave didn't move to pick up the money. He just looked at Blade, his gaze steady. "Take care of the bike," Dave said. "It'll last you if you treat it right." Blade smirked, as if he thought Dave's words were some kind of joke. "Yeah," Blade said, climbing onto the motorcycle. "Sure thing." The bikers didn't stop at words, they made their presence impossible to ignore. Ponytail picked up a wrench from the workbench and turned it over in his hands, as if testing its weight. He grinned and tossed it to Scarface, who caught it with a loud clang before dropping it back on the bench. The noise echoed through the shop, sharp and jarring. "Oops," Scarface said, his voice dripping with fake innocence. "Hope that wasn't important, Grandpa." Dave glanced over for just a second, his calm gaze meeting Scarface's mocking grin. He didn't say a word. He just kept working, tightening the bolts on Blade's bike. His hands moved with quiet confidence, steady, unshaken, and sure. But inside, Dave was taking mental notes. He'd dealt with guys like this before. Bullies. Loudmouths. Men who thought toughness came from their fists, their voices, or the number of skulls tattooed on their arms. Dave had no use for their noise. Real toughness, he knew, came from control. "You're awfully quiet back there, old man," Blade said suddenly, his voice cutting through the chatter. He was standing at the garage door now, silhouetted against the afternoon light, his massive frame casting a shadow across the concrete. "You scared of us or something?" Dave straightened up slowly, wiping grease from his fingers with an old rag. He turned toward Blade, his expression as calm as ever. "Nope," Dave said simply. That single word seemed to hang in the air. It wasn't what Blade had expected. He blinked, caught off guard for a half second, then smiled, a cold, crooked thing that didn't reach his eyes. "You hear that, boys?" Blade called over his shoulder, his voice rising. "Grandpa here's got some guts." The rest of the crew burst into laughter, loud and echoing, filling every corner of the shop. Ponytail slapped his knee, Scarface doubled over, and one of the others cracked open a beer, letting it spray foam onto the floor. Dave didn't flinch. He didn't rise to their bait. He just bent down, checked the chain on the motorcycle, and tightened it with slow, careful movements. "I asked you to fix the bike," Blade said, his voice growing sharper. "Not sit around playing with it. You're lucky I don't fix you instead." The shop fell quiet. The other bikers stopped laughing, their faces turning serious as they looked between Blade and Dave. Dave stood again and looked Blade square in the eye. There was no anger in his expression, no sign that the threat had rattled him. If anything, the stillness in his gaze made Blade pause just for a second. "It'll be done when it's done," Dave said calmly. "You can wait, or you can leave." For a moment, nobody said a word. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Nobody talked to Blade like that. Nobody. Blade's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring slightly. Then he chuckled, a low, dark sound that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. "You've got a mouth on you, old man," Blade said, stepping closer. "But I don't think you get it. See, we don't wait for anyone." The other bikers nodded and murmured their agreement, their eyes narrowing on Dave like predators circling prey. Scarface cracked his knuckles, as if daring Dave to say something else. Ponytail sneered, taking another swig from his beer. Dave didn't move. He just stood there, holding the rag loosely in his hands, his calm gaze locked on Blade. "Then you can take the bike somewhere else," Dave said simply. "Nobody's forcing you to stay." The room went silent again. The bikers looked at each other, clearly not used to being told what to do. Ponytail opened his mouth to say something, but Blade raised a hand, silencing him. Blade stared at Dave for a long moment, his dark eyes searching for any hint of fear. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a growl. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood today," Blade said, his words slow and deliberate. "Just fix the damn bike before my mood changes." Dave didn't respond. He just nodded once and turned back to the motorcycle, picking up his tools again. Blade held his gaze on Dave for a second longer before stepping back, clearly annoyed that the mechanic wasn't rattled. "Let's go outside," Blade said to his crew. "This place stinks like oil and old people." Scarface and Ponytail snickered, following Blade toward the parking lot. The others trailed after them, their boots clunking heavily against the concrete floor. One of them, shorter and stockier than the rest, paused at the garage door and gave Dave a lingering look. "Hope you're fast with those hands, old man," the biker said, smirking. "Wouldn't want us to get bored while we wait." Dave didn't answer. He didn't even look up. He just focused on the bike, working with calm precision. The bikers spilled into the parking lot like a pack of wolves, their laughter and jeers filling the air. Blade lit a cigarette, the smoke curling lazily around his head as he leaned against a beat-up car parked near the shop. Ponytail leaned over the hood, scratching the paint with his belt buckle while Scarface kicked at an old tire sitting nearby. "Man, this town is a snooze fest," Ponytail said, his voice loud and exaggerated. "How do people live in a dump like this?" "Because they're losers," Scarface replied, laughing. "Just like that mechanic." Blade exhaled a cloud of smoke and looked back toward the shop. Through the garage door, he could see Dave still working calm and quiet, like nothing was happening. Blade's lip curled. Something about that old man's calmness was starting to irritate him. "Hey, Scar," Blade said suddenly, his tone sharp. "Go check on our friend. Make sure he's not slacking." Scarface grinned. "You got it?" He sauntered back toward the garage, his boots loud against the gravel. Inside, Dave was adjusting the timing chain, his hands moving steadily. Scarface leaned against the door frame, watching him for a moment. "You always this slow?" Scarface sneered. "Or just saving your strength for retirement?" Dave didn't respond. He didn't even look up. Scarface's grin faltered slightly. He picked up a nearby socket wrench and tossed it onto the floor with a loud clatter. "You deaf, Grandpa?" Scarface snapped. "I'm talking to you." Finally, Dave looked up, his expression calm but firm. "I'm busy," Dave said quietly. "If you're bored, you can wait outside." Scarface's face twisted in annoyance. He wasn't used to being dismissed. "Watch your tone," Scarface said, stepping closer. "You might regret it." Dave didn't flinch. His gaze stayed locked on Scarface, steady as ever. "I've got work to do," Dave said simply. "Go on." Scarface froze. Something about the way Dave said it so calm, so certain made the younger man hesitate. He opened his mouth to say something else, but Blade's voice cut through the air from outside. "Scar! Leave the old man alone." Scarface turned back toward the lot, throwing Dave a final glare before walking away. Dave waited until Scarface was gone before turning back to the motorcycle. His hands moved steadily, his mind sharp and focused. But he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. These bikers were testing him, poking at him to see how far they could go. Dave had seen men like this before, and he knew exactly what they were trying to do. They wanted him to crack. They wanted him to give in, to get scared, or to fight back. But Dave wasn't going to give them what they wanted. Not yet. Outside, the bikers were growing restless. Scarface kicked an old hubcap across the lot, letting it clang loudly against the garage wall. Ponytail was leaning back on his bike, running his hand through his greasy hair while Blade smoked another cigarette, his eyes narrowed and fixed on the garage door like a hawk watching its prey. "Man, this guy's too slow," Scarface grumbled, pacing in front of the shop. "I don't trust him to get it right." Ponytail snorted, spitting onto the ground. "What'd you expect? He's probably been fixing lawnmowers for half his life. Real machines are too much for him." Blade didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring into the garage as if he were trying to see through walls. After a moment, he spoke, his voice low and cold. "If that bike isn't running in the next hour, we're gonna teach him a little lesson," Blade said, his words carrying a dangerous edge. The others grinned and nodded, their excitement growing. Scarface slapped his hands together, cracking his knuckles. "About time," he said with a smirk. Inside the garage, Dave could hear their voices. The walls weren't thick, and they weren't exactly trying to keep quiet. He stayed focused on his work, his hands moving with precision. The motorcycle had more problems than the bikers had let on: bad chain tension, misfiring spark plugs, and an oil leak that had gone unchecked for too long. "Amateurs," Dave muttered under his breath. From outside, Scarface's voice cut through the noise again. "Hey, old man. You better not be talking to yourself in there. Maybe you're trying to figure out which bolt goes where." Dave didn't respond. He didn't need to. Words weren't going to change these men. But actions. Actions were different. The bikers grew louder as time dragged on. They stomped around a lot, kicked at loose pieces of metal, and occasionally shouted insults toward the garage. Blade stood apart from them, leaning against the hood of an old car, his arms crossed over his chest. "Time's ticking," Blade said finally, flicking his cigarette to the ground. "I'm starting to think you're stalling, old man." Dave heard the comment, but he didn't look up. He knew what they were trying to do, push him, bait him into reacting. But he wasn't going to play their game. Not yet. At some point, the noise from outside stopped. The sudden silence made Dave pause for a moment, his wrench still in hand. Something wasn't right. He turned slightly, glancing toward the garage door. Blade was standing just inside the shop now, his boots heavy against the concrete floor as he walked toward Dave. The other bikers trailed in behind him, their eyes cold and predatory. "I'm losing my patience," Blade said, his voice low but sharp. "You've had long enough. Is the bike ready, or are you playing games with me?" Dave wiped his hands on a rag, slowly turning to face Blade. "It'll be ready when it's ready," Dave said calmly. Blade's face twitched, just for a second. The others took a step closer, as if sensing the tension in the air. Scarface's hands were balled into fists at his sides. Ponytail was grinning, like he was waiting for the fireworks to start. "You think you're funny, don't you?" Blade said, his tone dropping even lower. "You think you can mess with us and get away with it?" Dave didn't blink. He met Blade's glare with quiet confidence, unshaken. "I'm not messing with anyone," Dave said. "I'm just fixing your bike." Scarface barked out a laugh, stepping closer to Dave. "What'd I tell you, Blade? He's got a mouth on him." Blade's eyes never left Dave. He took another step forward, close enough now that Dave could smell the faint trace of cigarette smoke and leather. "You don't seem to get it," Blade said. "You don't keep us waiting. Not here. Not ever." Dave tilted his head slightly, still calm. "You want your bike fixed or not?" Blade's hand shot out suddenly, grabbing the wrench Dave had been using off the workbench. He held it up, turning it over in his hand. "You like tools, don't you?" Blade said, his voice taunting. "Let's see how well you work without 'em." With that, he tossed the wrench across the garage. It hit the far wall with a loud crash, sending tools scattering to the ground. Ponytail and Scarface laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. Dave's jaw tightened, just for a moment. He glanced toward where the wrench had landed, then back at Blade. "Real mature," Dave said evenly. The laughter stopped. Scarface's grin faltered. Blade's eyes narrowed. "What'd you just say?" Blade asked, his voice cold. Dave didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. Blade's hand twitched, as if he were fighting the urge to take a swing. Scarface and Ponytail edged closer, waiting to see what Blade would do next. "Careful," Dave said quietly, his voice like steel. "You don't want to make me angry." For a moment, there was silence. The bikers stared at Dave, blinking as if they hadn't heard him right. Then Ponytail burst out laughing again. "You? Angry?" Ponytail sneered, clutching his stomach. "That's rich. What are you gonna do, hit us with your cane?" Scarface joined in, shaking his head. "Old man, you couldn't take on a puppy, let alone us." Dave didn't respond. He didn't even look at them. He just turned back to the bike, picked up another tool from the bench, and got back to work. Blade watched him, his face unreadable. For a moment, it looked like he might say something else. But then he turned sharply and walked back toward the garage door, his boots echoing on the concrete. "Let's go outside," Blade said to the others, his voice tight. "We'll deal with this in a minute." Scarface gave Dave one last sneer before following Blade, while Ponytail kicked over a nearby oil can on his way out. The black liquid spilled across the floor, spreading slowly like a shadow. Dave didn't stop working. He didn't clean up the oil, didn't pick up the tools the bikers had tossed around. There would be time for that later. For now, all that mattered was fixing the bike. But as he worked, his mind was turning. He'd seen enough of the bikers to know what they were planning. They weren't just going to leave. No, they were waiting for something for him to mess up, for the job to take too long, or for an excuse to start trouble. Dave had dealt with their kind before. Men who thought strength came from noise and threats. But real strength? That was something else entirely. He worked steadily, his hands moving with the kind of confidence that comes from years of experience. He tightened bolts, adjusted the chain tension, and checked the fuel lines. He wasn't rushing, he didn't need to. From outside, he could still hear the bikers laughing and shouting. They were trying to rattle him, but it wasn't going to work. Not on Dave. Almost done, he muttered to himself. The bike was coming together. Slowly but surely. And once it was ready? Well, Dave had a feeling Blade and his crew were going to find out exactly what kind of man they'd been messing with. Dave crouched down beside the motorcycle, his hands steady and sure as he inspected the chain. At first glance, everything seemed fine, but when you've spent 40 years around machines, you learn to look closer. He ran his fingers along the chain links, pausing at a specific point. A faint scratch. An unusual groove. It was subtle, so subtle that only someone with a sharp eye would ever notice. He frowned. Something was wrong. Dave pulled a flashlight from the bench and leaned in closer. The chain hadn't snapped naturally, it had been tampered with. The links had been filed down, just enough to fail under stress. Whoever had done it had known exactly what they were doing, but they'd been sloppy. To an expert like Dave, it stood out like a sore thumb. He stood up slowly, rubbing his chin, his mind racing. It wasn't just the chain. He'd already seen signs of trouble in the engine. The bolts were tightened incorrectly, the spark plugs were mismatched, and the carburetor had been flooded deliberately. This bike hadn't been damaged by accident, someone had sabotaged it. The question was, why? Outside, Blade and his crew were lounging against their bikes, tossing beer cans into the dirt and laughing like hyenas. Scarface had taken to shouting insults into the shop every now and then, as if daring Dave to respond. "You fixing it, Grandpa, or are you knitting us a scarf in there?" Scarface yelled, his voice grating. Dave didn't answer. He stood still for a moment, staring at the bike as if it held all the answers. Who sabotages their own motorcycle? That's when it hit him. This wasn't about fixing a bike. It was about something bigger. Dave glanced through the garage's dusty window, his eyes locking onto Blade. The man was sitting on the hood of a car, arms crossed, watching the garage like a hawk. There was something in his posture, something deliberate. It was like Blade was waiting. "Interesting," Dave murmured under his breath. The sudden bang of a fist against the counter made Dave jump slightly. He turned to see Blade, his towering frame filling the doorway. His dark eyes were locked on Dave, unblinking. "What's taking so long?" Blade growled. His voice was sharp and heavy, like a blade cutting through the air. Dave straightened up, wiping his hands on his rag with slow, deliberate movements. He looked calmer than he should have been. "Almost done," Dave said, his voice steady. "Just making sure you boys get back on the road, safely." There was something about the way Dave said that last word. It was subtle, almost too subtle, but it was there, a little edge, a hint of something sharper hiding under the surface. Blade's eyes narrowed slightly. "You trying to be funny, old man?" he asked, his tone dangerous. Dave didn't flinch. He just smiled, a small, knowing smile. The kind of smile that made you wonder what someone else knew. "No jokes here," Dave replied. "Just doing my job." Blade stared at him for a moment longer, then turned and stomped back out to the lot. The door slammed behind him, rattling the tools on the walls. Dave watched him go, his smile fading. He turned back to the bike, his mind still turning. Something's not right, he thought again. Dave worked in silence, his hands moving with purpose as he began tightening bolts and adjusting parts. He was focused, but his mind wasn't on the bike anymore. It was on the men outside, their laughter, their taunts, the way they lingered. The bikers weren't just here for a quick fix. If they were, they would have gone by now. No, they were stalling, waiting for something. But what? As Dave twisted the wrench, he glanced toward the garage door. Through the narrow window, he could see Blade pacing in the parking lot. Scarface and Ponytail were busy messing with a dented old car, kicking its tires and scribbling nonsense on its dusty windshield. Dave noticed something else, too, a black SUV parked across the street. It had tinted windows, the kind you couldn't see through, and it hadn't moved since the bikers arrived. A man sat behind the wheel, barely visible, but Dave caught glimpses of him checking his watch, glancing at the garage. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Dave's gut twist. This isn't just a bike repair, he realized. This is something else. Dave reached for a wrench on the bench, but his hand froze mid-air. The wrench was gone. He looked around quickly, scanning the garage. Tools had been scattered everywhere. Ponytail had knocked half of them over earlier, but this one was missing. He frowned, stepping back and checking the floor. Nothing. "Looking for this?" The voice came from behind him. Dave turned to see Scarface standing in the doorway, holding the missing wrench. He spun it lazily in his hand, smirking. "You shouldn't leave your tools lying around, old man," Scarface sneered. Dave held out his hand. "Give it back." Scarface grinned wider, stepping deeper into the garage. "Make me." Dave didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just held Scarface's gaze, his eyes calm and steady. For a moment, Scarface's smile faltered. There was something about the way Dave looked at him, like he could see right through him. "Fine," Scarface muttered, tossing the wrench onto the floor with a loud clang. "Don't get your knickers in a twist." He turned and walked out, laughing to himself. Dave watched him go, his expression hard. He bent down, picked up the wrench, and turned back to the bike. As Dave worked, his suspicions grew stronger. Every part he checked revealed something else that had been tampered with. The brakes had been loosened. The fuel line had been cut just enough to leak under pressure. Whoever had sabotaged this bike wasn't trying to fix it, they were trying to destroy it. Dave wiped his brow, leaning back and taking a deep breath. His gut was telling him something loud and clear now: this wasn't about fixing a bike at all. This was about sending a message. But to who? He thought about Blade, the way he stood apart from his crew, watching everything. And he thought about the black SUV across the street, the man waiting inside it. This is bigger than it looks, Dave thought. He grabbed a rag, cleaning his hands. Then he turned to look through the window again. The bikers were still there, but now they were quiet. Blade was leaning against his bike, staring at the garage like he could burn a hole through the walls with his eyes. Dave sighed. Whatever game they were playing, he wasn't going to lose. Finally, Dave stood up and wiped his hands clean. He walked toward the garage door and pushed it open. The sudden sound made the bikers look up. Blade stood straighter, his eyes narrowing as Dave walked toward him. "It's ready," Dave said simply. Blade didn't move right away. He just stared at Dave, as if he were trying to read him. Finally, he nodded and walked toward the garage. Scarface and Ponytail followed, their grins returning. About time, Scarface muttered. Dave stepped aside as they approached the bike, but he didn't go far. He crossed his arms, leaning against the workbench, and watched them carefully. Blade crouched down beside the bike, his fingers brushing over the freshly tightened bolts and clean chain. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "You sure it's good to ride?" Blade asked, his voice low. Dave smiled faintly. "It'll get you where you need to go." Blade stared at him for another moment, then stood up. "Good." Scarface slapped Blade's shoulder. "Let's hit the road. We're done with this dump." Blade didn't respond. He just looked at Dave again, his expression unreadable. "You're a quiet man," Blade said finally. "But I'm starting to think you know more than you let on." Dave met his gaze, unflinching. "I know enough." For a moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Blade nodded, turning toward the lot. But Dave wasn't done. "Not yet." "Hey," Dave called out suddenly. Blade stopped, turning back to face him. "Careful out there," Dave said. "Some machines don't like to be pushed too hard." Blade narrowed his eyes. "I'll take my chances." With that, the bikers started their engines. But as the roar of the motorcycles echoed through the lot, Dave knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Dave watched the bikers fire up their machines, the deep rumble of engines filling the afternoon air. Blade's motorcycle roared to life, its sound more menacing than the others, like a predator announcing its presence. Scarface and Ponytail were already grinning, revving their engines, eager to leave. But Blade didn't take off immediately. He sat there on the bike, one hand resting on the throttle, staring back at Dave like he was waiting for something. Dave didn't flinch. His calm gaze held steady, though his gut told him that Blade wasn't done. "Not yet." "You sure this ride's good, old man?" Blade called out, his voice carrying over the roar of the engines. Dave wiped his hands on his rag and tucked it into his back pocket. "It's good. Just treat it right." Blade's eyes narrowed slightly. There was a warning hidden somewhere in Dave's voice, subtle but there. A man like Blade didn't miss those kinds of things. "You talk like you know something I don't," Blade said, his tone low and challenging. Dave shrugged. "Maybe I do." That answer seemed to hit a nerve. Scarface barked out a laugh. "You hear that, Blade? Grandpa thinks he's got secrets." The bikers laughed, their voices loud and grating. But Blade didn't join them. His eyes stayed locked on Dave, watching him like a man sizing up his opponent. Finally, he gave a small, humorless grin. "We'll see," Blade muttered, and with that, he twisted the throttle. The motorcycle shot forward, tires screeching against the pavement. Scarface and Ponytail followed close behind, their engines howling as they tore out of the parking lot. Dust and gravel sprayed everywhere, rattling against the shop's windows. For a long moment, the air was still again. Dave stood there, watching the road where the bikers had disappeared. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, grease-streaked notepad. Flipping it open, he scribbled something down, something about the engine he'd just fixed. "They won't get far," Dave muttered to himself. The sound of their engines faded into the distance, but that strange feeling in Dave's gut wouldn't go away. He turned back toward the shop, pausing just for a moment to look across the street. The black SUV was still parked there. Its windows were dark as ever. Whoever was inside had seen the whole thing. Dave shook his head and headed back into the garage. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, but Dave couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. Something was wrong, he knew it. He could feel it in his bones. As the sun began to dip low on the horizon, the phone on the shop counter rang. Dave wiped his hands, glanced at the old rotary phone, and sighed. "Dave's Auto Repair," he answered. The line crackled for a moment before a voice came through. Low and steady. You fixed Blade's bike, didn't you? Dave's brow furrowed. Who's asking? You don't need to know my name, the voice replied. What you need to know is this: Blade's crew isn't just any group of bikers. You should have turned them away. The line went dead. Dave stood there for a long moment, holding the receiver. He didn't need anyone to tell him who Blade was. His gut had already told him plenty. But now things were starting to make sense. The sabotaged bike. The lingering. The SUV. It was all connected. He glanced at the clock. The shop was supposed to close in 10 minutes, but Dave knew better than to lock up and head home. Not tonight. It didn't take long. Just as the last light of day faded, the sound of motorcycle engines echoed down the road again. Louder this time. Angrier. Dave stood behind the counter, his expression calm but his jaw set. Outside, the bikes rolled back into the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the dark like blades. Blade was the first to dismount. His expression was stone cold, but his movements were sharp and deliberate. Scarface and Ponytail followed, their usual sneers replaced by something meaner. Something darker. Blade pushed the door open with enough force to make the bell overhead jingle violently. Dave didn't move. He just watched as Blade and his crew marched inside. What's the problem? Dave asked, his voice steady. Blade stepped up to the counter, planting his fists on it. His face was inches from Dave's, his dark eyes burning with anger. You think you're clever, don't you? Blade growled. Dave raised an eyebrow. Did the bike give you trouble? Blade slammed his hand onto the counter, rattling the old cash register. Don't play games with me, old man. You knew. Knew what? Blade's face twisted into a snarl. Someone tampered with the bike. We barely made it out of town before it almost came apart. Scarface chimed in, his voice a sneer. You trying to get us killed, huh? That your idea of a joke? Dave's gaze didn't waver. I fixed what you brought me. If someone else messed with it before, that's not my problem. Blade stared at him, breathing hard. For a moment, no one said anything. The air was thick with tension, and Dave could feel the storm coming. You think we're stupid? Blade hissed. We know you're hiding something. You think you're untouchable, huh? Dave didn't answer. He just looked Blade in the eye, calm as ever. Scarface grabbed a wrench off a nearby bench and held it up like a weapon. Maybe we teach you a lesson. Show you what happens when you mess with the wrong people. Dave didn't flinch. He folded his arms across his chest and said, Go ahead. Swing that wrench. Scarface froze, blinking in surprise. Blade turned to glare at him, and Scarface slowly lowered the wrench, grumbling under his breath. You've got guts, old man, Blade said finally, his voice quieter now, but more dangerous. But guts won't save you. Maybe not, Dave replied. But I'm not the one with the broken bike. Blade's nostrils flared. For a long moment, it seemed like he might lunge across the counter. But then he stepped back, his face still twisted with fury. This isn't over, Blade said. You'll wish you never met us. The three bikers turned and stormed out of the shop. Engines roared to life once again, and within moments, they were gone. Dave let out a slow breath and ran a hand through his graying hair. He glanced back toward the road and muttered, No, this isn't over. Not yet. That night, Dave locked up the shop and headed home, but his mind didn't rest. He sat in his small kitchen, sipping black coffee and staring out the window. The town of Willow Ridge was peaceful at night, the streets empty and quiet. But Dave knew better than to trust the quiet. He thought about Blade and his crew, about the sabotage, about the SUV that had watched it all unfold. Something bigger was at play here, something dangerous, and Dave had just become a part of it. Most men would have walked away. Most men would have closed the shop and skipped town. But Dave wasn't most men. He reached into an old wooden box under the sink, pulling out a pair of worn leather gloves and a set of keys. The gloves were familiar, they fit his hands like they'd been made just for him. In the corner of his garage sat a tarp-covered shape, hidden under layers of dust. Dave pulled back the tarp slowly, revealing a motorcycle of his own. It wasn't flashy, but it was built to last. A machine crafted with precision and care, unlike the battered rides Blade's crew had. Dave ran a hand over the seat, his face thoughtful. Time to remind them who they're dealing with. The roar of the engines faded into the distance as Blade and his crew tore off down the road. Gravel spit from under their tires, a cloud of dust marking their departure. The sun had started to dip lower on the horizon, and long shadows stretched across the cracked pavement of Willow Ridge's lone street. Dave stood at the garage door, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He watched as the bikers disappeared down the straight road leading out of town, heading toward the empty countryside. He didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just waited. The minutes dragged on. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk screeched, and the wind rustled through the trees that lined the road. It was the kind of evening that should have been peaceful, quiet. But not tonight. Dave's eyes stayed fixed on the spot where Blade's motorcycle had vanished. A loud, explosive bang split the silence. It was sharp, metallic, unnatural against the quiet hum of the evening. The sound echoed back to the shop, carried by the wind like a warning shot. Dave didn't blink. He knew exactly what that sound was. A slow grin curled at the corner of his lips. A mile down the road, Blade's motorcycle suddenly shuddered and jerked violently. He barely had time to process what was happening before the entire machine locked up beneath him. The back wheel screeched, fishtailing and wobbling uncontrollably. "What the?" Blade yelled, his voice drowned out by the screech of rubber on asphalt. He gripped the handlebars tight, but it was no use. The motorcycle bucked like a wild animal, tilting hard to one side. Blade was thrown from the seat, his body skidding across the rough pavement. The sound of leather scraping against concrete was enough to make even the toughest biker wince. Scarface and Ponytail were the first to see it happen. They slammed on their brakes, tires squealing as they came to an abrupt stop. Their eyes widened in disbelief as Blade tumbled, his motorcycle sparking and spinning before coming to a mangled stop in a ditch. "Blade!" Ponytail shouted, leaping off his bike and running toward the wreck. Scarface followed close behind, his face pale beneath the layer of dirt and sweat. Blade groaned, struggling to push himself up on shaky arms. Blood trickled down from a scrape on his forehead, and his knuckles were raw and red. His leather jacket, once pristine, was now ripped and scuffed. "What happened?" Scarface asked, his voice tied with panic. Blade coughed, spitting dust from his mouth. He turned his head toward the wrecked motorcycle. It sat there in the ditch, smoke curling lazily from its engine like it was mocking him. "It locked up," Blade growled, his voice hoarse. "That old man did something to it." "I know he did." Ponytail glanced nervously back down the road, toward town. "You sure, man? Maybe it just..." "It wasn't me." Blade snapped, pushing himself to his feet with a groan. "He tampered with it. I could feel it the moment I hit the throttle." Scarface crouched by the bike, inspecting it with wide, suspicious eyes. He reached toward the engine, where something small and metallic glimmered under the fading light. "What the heck is this?" Scarface muttered, pulling out a tiny, bent piece of wire. Blade's eyes darkened. He snatched the wire from Scarface's hand, holding it up for the others to see. "This ain't normal. That mechanic rigged it. He set me up." Ponytail swallowed hard. "What do we do now, Blade?" Blade didn't answer at first. His mind was racing. The humiliation of being thrown from his bike, the anger at being outsmarted, and the sharp pain in his body all churned together into a rage he could barely contain. His fists clenched, the scrape on his knuckles stinging with each movement. Finally, he turned to Scarface and Ponytail. "We go back," Blade said coldly, his voice low and dangerous. "That old man thinks he's clever? He's about to find out how wrong he is." Back at the shop, Dave leaned against the counter, his eyes still fixed on the open garage door. The sun had nearly set, and the light inside the shop glowed a warm yellow against the encroaching dark. He didn't need to see what had happened to know. The sound of that bang had been all the confirmation he required. Like clockwork, he muttered to himself. Dave walked over to the workbench and opened a drawer. Inside sat a small, black toolbox, an old, familiar relic from a lifetime ago. He flipped the lid open, revealing a neat row of custom-made tools, each one gleaming under the light. They weren't your average wrenches and pliers. These tools were precise, specialized tools only someone with a specific kind of training would ever need. Dave picked up one of them, turning it over in his hand. His reflection stared back at him from its polished surface. "Some folks just don't learn," he said quietly, shaking his head. He set the tool down carefully and walked to the garage door. The road was empty, but he knew that wouldn't last. The bikers were coming back angrier than before. And Dave would be ready. The second arrival of the bikers was very different from the first. The quiet of the evening shattered as the unmistakable sound of motorcycles roared down the road once again. This time, there was no slow roll into the lot. No sneering, no swagger. Blade's crew came in fast, skidding to a stop in front of Dave's auto repair with all the subtlety of a freight train. Blade didn't even bother parking. He jumped off the back of Scarface's bike and stormed toward the shop, his face twisted in fury. Blood still stained his forehead, and his jacket was torn, evidence of his fall. Dave stood in the doorway, calm as ever. Blade stopped just a few feet away, jabbing a finger toward Dave's chest. "You think you're funny, don't you?" Dave raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong with your bike? Don't play dumb with me, old man." Blade roared. "You rigged it? You sabotaged me." Ponytail and Scarface flanked their leader, both looking uneasy. Ponytail glanced nervously around the shop, like he expected something or someone to jump out at any second. "I fixed what you brought me," Dave said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "If you don't know how to handle it, that's not my fault." "You liar!" Blade shouted, his face reddening. He stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "I should break you in half for what you did." Dave's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked almost bored. "You could try," Dave said quietly. "But it wouldn't end well for you." Scarface and Ponytail exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They had stormed into the shop ready to intimidate the old man into submission. Instead, he was staring them down like they were kids trying to pick a fight they couldn't win. Blade's nostrils flared, and he took another step forward, his muscles tensed like a coiled spring. But before he could move any further, Dave lifted his hand. "Before you do something stupid," Dave said, his voice low and measured, "there's something you need to know." Blade froze, glaring at him. "What?" Dave's eyes sharpened, and for the first time that day, his tone held something dangerous. "I'm not just a mechanic," Dave said. "I'm the guy they used to call when engines broke down in places you've never even heard of. When machines had to work no matter what." Ponytail frowned, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" Dave took a step forward, his gaze locked on Blade. "It means I used to build machines for the military. Engines. Weapons. Whatever they needed." Blade's anger faltered, just for a moment. Dave continued, his voice quiet but cutting through the silence like a knife. "So if you're gonna threaten me," Dave said, just know you're messing with the wrong man. Blade's face paled slightly as the realization hit him. Dave wasn't scared of them. Not because he was stubborn or crazy, but because he knew dangerous things. And suddenly, the whole shop felt a lot smaller. Blade's sneer faltered for just a second, but it was enough for Scarface and Ponytail to notice. They shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Blade and Dave, unsure of what to do next. The silence that followed Dave's words felt heavy, pressing against their chests like the weight of 100 bad decisions. Ponytail's voice wavered as he spoke. You're just bluffing. Old man like you. Military. Come on. Dave didn't blink. Instead, he held their gaze with a calm intensity that made Ponytail's words sound even weaker. You don't believe me? Go ahead, try me. Dave's tone was flat, steady, and for the first time, the bikers weren't so sure of themselves. Scarface shifted his weight nervously. Blade, maybe we should. Blade shot him a glare so sharp it could have cut through glass. Shut up. The anger in Blade's eyes reignited, his pride outweighing his caution. He clenched his fists tighter, his knuckles turning white. I don't care who you used to be, old man. Nobody messes with me or my crew and gets away with it. Dave's expression didn't change, but the faintest trace of disappointment flickered in his eyes. You don't get it, do you? He said softly. Blade stepped forward, a few feet away from Dave now. His presence loomed like a storm cloud ready to burst, and the tension crackled in the air. Scarface and Ponytail stayed back, no longer looking so sure about their fearless leader. Enough talk. Blade snapped, raising his fist as if he was ready to swing. Time to teach you a lesson. Before Blade could move, Dave took one step closer and raised his hand not in defense, but in a way that froze Blade where he stood. I'm giving you one last chance, son, Dave said quietly. His voice was firm, even, with the kind of authority that only comes from years of experience. Walk away. Take your boys and leave this shop in one piece. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to. Blade's lip curled into a mocking smirk. You hurt me. But something about the way Dave looked at him, a calm stare that didn't flinch, didn't waver, made the smirk waver for half a second. People like you think the loudest guy in the room's the toughest, Dave said, his voice low and calm. But real strength? That's quiet. You don't see it coming until it's too late. Scarface swallowed hard. Blade, maybe we should listen to him. I told you to shut up. Blade barked, whipping around to glare at Scarface. Dave shook his head slowly, letting out a quiet sigh. Suit yourself. Blade turned back toward Dave, his fists still clenched. But before he could take another step, Dave moved. It happened so fast, none of the bikers saw it coming. Dave reached over to the workbench and grabbed the wrench, his movements smooth, practiced. In one clean motion, he swung the tool down onto a metal barrel beside him with a deafening clang. The sound reverberated through the shop like a gunshot. The sudden noise startled Blade and his crew, making them flinch instinctively. Scarface took a step back, nearly tripping over his own feet. Ponytail let out a surprised yelp, his eyes darting toward the old man with a mix of fear and confusion. Blade, despite his bravado, froze for a split second. Dave's hand rested on the wrench, now sitting calmly atop the dented barrel. He stared at Blade, unblinking, his face deadly serious. That's how fast it happens, Dave said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. And that was me being polite. Ponytail's voice shook. He's not bluffing, Blade. Look at him. Blade's chest rose and fell with quick, shallow breaths. For the first time, he looked unsure. What's the matter? Dave asked, still calm. You were so sure a minute ago. Want to try again? Blade didn't respond, so Dave continued. His voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that hinted at the man he used to be. "You want to know who I really am?" Dave asked, letting the words hang for a moment. "I built machines for men who went places you'll never go. I spent years in the dirt and sand, fixing engines under fire while the real tough guys, men you wouldn't last 5 minutes with, trusted me to keep them alive." Ponytail's face paled. Scarface stared at Dave, his eyes wide. Dave took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Blade. "I know how to take things apart, and I know how to put them back together. That bike you rode in here with? It's a child's toy compared to what I used to work on. And the difference between you and me," he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, "is I know how to finish what I start." Blade opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He stood frozen, the confidence and arrogance he had worn so proudly starting to crack. Scarface broke the silence. "Blade, let's just leave, man. This guy's, he's not normal." Blade shot him another glare, but even Scarface could see that it was hollow now, more bravado than anger. "We're not leaving," Blade muttered, though his voice lacked the bite it had before. "I'm not letting some old mechanic show me up." Dave smiled faintly. It wasn't a kind smile, it was the smile of someone who knew exactly how this would end. "Still not listening, huh?" Dave said softly. He stepped back toward his workbench, reaching for something else. This time, it wasn't a wrench. It was a small black object, a remote control, simple and unassuming. Dave held it up where they could all see it. "What's that?" Ponytail asked nervously, his voice barely above a whisper. Dave tilted his head slightly, looking at Blade. "You really want to find out?" Blade stared at the remote, his expression shifting from anger to hesitation. For the first time, there was a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. Dave's calm voice filled the room. "I told you to walk away. I told you I'm not the kind of man you can push around. But you wouldn't listen." Blade's face was pale now, his bravado completely gone. Ponytail and Scarface were already backing away, their instincts screaming at them to leave while they still could. "You've got 10 seconds to decide," Dave said, his thumb hovering over the button on the remote. "Decide what?" Blade snapped, though his voice cracked as he spoke. "Whether you want to leave my shop in one piece, or find out what happens when you don't." The shop fell completely silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. 1 second. 2. 3. Ponytail grabbed Scarface's arm. "Come on. We're leaving." Scarface didn't argue. Together, they turned and hurried out of the shop, not even bothering to look back. Blade stayed frozen for a moment longer, his eyes flicking between Dave and the remote. Finally, with a muttered curse, he turned and stormed after his crew. Dave lowered the remote, setting it gently back onto the workbench. It hadn't been connected to anything, just an old, useless piece of plastic. But they didn't need to know that. He smiled faintly, walking to the doorway and watching the bikers as they climbed onto their motorcycles and sped away, this time not daring to look back. The roar of their engines faded into the distance once again, and the shop grew quiet. Dave stood there for a moment longer, his hands in his pockets, staring out at the empty road. "Some people never learn," he murmured to himself, shaking his head. He turned back toward the shop, the light from inside spilling out across the gravel lot. There was a satisfaction in his step, a quiet victory. Dave Dawson, the quiet mechanic of Willow Ridge, had sent another group of troublemakers packing. And somewhere deep inside, a part of him that had been silent for years smiled. Because the truth was simple. They had messed with the wrong man. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty lot of Dave's auto repair. The roar of the bikers' engines had disappeared down the road, leaving a stillness in the air that hadn't been there before. Dave stood in the doorway of his shop, arms crossed, a faint line of grease smudged across his forearm. The once arrogant men had left with their heads low, shoulders slumped in defeat. For the first time in a long while, Dave felt something settle deep within him, a peace that only came when justice had been served. From the corner of his eye, Dave noticed a small group of townspeople peeking out from behind their shop fronts across the street. They'd clearly been watching the events unfold, though most had been too afraid to get involved. Dave gave a small wave, and some of them nodded back, almost shyly. Word would spread, no doubt about that. Willow Ridge was a small town, and stories like this traveled faster than any motorcycle ever could. As Dave turned to head back into his shop, the sound of gravel crunching under heavy boots reached his ears. He paused. Slowly, he glanced over his shoulder, and there they were, limping, sore, and dragging their pride behind them. Blade was at the center of it, flanked by Scarface and Ponytail. Blade's leather jacket was torn, dirt streaked across his face, and his wrist hung awkwardly by his side, suggesting he'd taken the brunt of the fall. The others looked no better. Limps, bruises, and shame were all they had left. They didn't come roaring back like they had the first time. There was no bravado in their movements. Instead, they shuffled forward, like dogs with their tails between their legs. Blade's eyes burned with anger, but there was something else there, too, a flicker of wariness. Dave leaned casually against the doorframe, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp as ever. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." Blade stumbled a little, biting back whatever insult was at the tip of his tongue. Instead, he pointed a trembling finger at Dave. You set us up." His voice shook not just from rage, but from something closer to fear. Dave didn't move. He simply lifted his hand to reveal the greasy, tangled motorcycle chain, the very same one Blade had sabotaged earlier. The sunlight caught its jagged edges as it swayed lazily in Dave's grip. "You set yourself up," Dave replied evenly, his voice as steady as ever. "All I did was make sure you couldn't hurt anyone else." "That chain? That engine?" He paused, narrowing his eyes at Blade. "That wasn't an accident. That was sloppy work, your sloppy work." Scarface and Ponytail exchanged uneasy glances. They were starting to put the pieces together. "You mean," Scarface muttered. "Blade, you." Blade shot him a glare, cutting him off. "Shut it." Dave pushed himself off the doorframe, stepping closer to the bikers. Despite the fact that Blade towered over him, Dave's quiet confidence made him seem 10 feet tall. "See, you boys think you can roll into town, push people around, and get away with it," Dave said, his tone low and deliberate. "You think nobody'll stand up to you. But you're wrong. Real men? They don't need to bark and show their teeth to be strong. Real men fix things instead of breaking them." The words cut through the bikers like a cold wind. Ponytail's eyes dropped to the ground, shame pooling in his expression. Scarface shuffled awkwardly, clearly wondering how he'd ended up following Blade in the first place. Blade, though, still had fight in his eyes. He opened his mouth, ready to spit out another insult, another threat. But Dave held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "You're done here." Dave's voice rang with finality. "Take your broken pride, your broken bikes, and whatever's left of your crew, and get out. And don't come back." For the first time, Blade didn't have a response. His jaw worked as if he was chewing on words he couldn't quite get out. He glanced back at Scarface and Ponytail, but they weren't looking at him anymore. Ponytail spoke first, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't want any part of this, Blade. You're on your own." Scarface nodded in agreement. "Me neither. This whole thing was stupid." Blade looked like he'd been punched in the gut. His crew, the same men who'd laughed and cheered when they first rolled into the shop, were walking away from him, leaving him standing alone in the dirt. He turned back to Dave, fury flashing across his face. "You think you won," he hissed through gritted teeth. Dave didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in Blade's eyes told him everything he needed to know. Blade clenched his fists, his shoulders heaving with frustration. But in the end, he didn't have the fight left in him. Without another word, he turned on his heel, stalking back to his battered bike. Scarface and Ponytail followed him reluctantly, but with the kind of resignation that only comes after learning a hard lesson. They climbed onto their bikes, engines sputtering to life. This time, the roar wasn't proud or deafening, it sounded tired. Humbled. Dave stood with his hands in his pockets, watching as the three bikers rolled out of the lot for the last time. The gravel crunched beneath their wheels, and then, silence. It didn't take long for people to start showing up. A handful of neighbors had been watching from a distance, but now they trickled into Dave's lot, curiosity and admiration plain on their faces. "Dave," someone called out. "You okay?" Dave smiled faintly, wiping his hands on his grease-stained rag. "Never better." A young man named Todd approached him first. Todd worked over at the diner, and like everyone else, he'd heard rumors about Dave's quiet past. You really sent those guys packing, huh?" Dave shrugged modestly. "They made their own mess. I just made sure they cleaned it up." "Is it true you used to be?" Todd started to ask, but Dave raised a hand, cutting him off with a small, knowing smile. "Some stories are better left in the past," Dave said simply. The townspeople murmured among themselves, some nodding in agreement, others sharing their own versions of what they'd seen. Word would spread like wildfire. Dave's calm stand against the bikers would become legend in Willow Ridge. People who'd once underestimated the quiet mechanic now looked at him with newfound respect. For years, they'd taken Dave for granted. Now they realized that behind his easygoing demeanor lay a man who didn't flinch when it mattered most. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the sky turned a deep shade of orange, Dave sat alone in his shop. The lights were dim, and the familiar hum of the radio played softly in the background. He leaned back in his chair, sipping a mug of coffee, staring at the quiet lot where the bikers had stood just hours earlier. He'd faced men like Blade before, men who mistook noise for power, who thought intimidation could get them anything they wanted. But bullies, no matter how loud, always folded when they ran into someone who wouldn't back down. Dave smiled faintly to himself. It wasn't about winning or proving anything to anyone. It wasn't even about teaching Blade and his crew a lesson. It was about making sure his shop and his town stayed a place where people treated each other with respect. And as long as Dave Dawson had breath in his lungs, he'd make sure of it. The following day, business at Dave's auto repair carried on as usual. Cars pulled in, customers dropped off keys, and Dave worked with the same quiet focus he always had. But things were different now. People lingered a little longer when they came by, chatting with Dave and thanking him for what he'd done. There was respect in their voices, and a sense of pride in their town that hadn't been there before. Todd stopped by the shop again, bringing Dave a slice of pie from the diner. "On the house," he said with a grin. Dave chuckled softly, accepting the plate. "Thanks, kid." Todd hesitated for a moment, then said, "You know, you're kind of a hero now." Dave shook his head, his smile faint. "I'm no hero. Just a man who doesn't like bullies." Todd nodded thoughtfully. "Well, whatever you are, Willow Ridge is lucky to have you." Dave didn't respond, but his smile lingered as he turned back to his workbench. Out on the road, the gravel lot was empty. No bikers. No trouble. Just peace and quiet the way Dave liked it. As Dave went back to his tools, he thought about the day's events. The shop had quieted down now. The sound of hammers, wrenches, and the hum of engines were once again the familiar noises that filled the space. The soft glow of the overhead light illuminated the workbench, where Dave stood, his hands steady as he tightened the last few bolts on a car engine. Outside, the sun had dipped low, casting an orange glow over the lot. Dave didn't feel the need for any grand gestures. He wasn't the kind of person who sought applause or recognition. In fact, he had always preferred it this way, quiet, unassuming, just another regular day in the shop. But today had been different. It wasn't about the bikers or the confrontation. It wasn't even about the triumph. It was something deeper. He wiped his hands on a rag, taking a moment to reflect. In the quiet of the shop, his thoughts turned to the bikers. Blade and his crew. People like that were easy to dismiss, loud, brash, thinking they could push others around. They believed their strength came from noise and force. But Dave knew something they didn't. True strength wasn't about how loud you could be or how many people feared you. True strength was in your ability to stand your ground, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. Blade thought he was the one in control, the one who ran things. But all it took was one moment, one decision, to show who was truly in charge. And that wasn't something Blade or his crew would ever expect. Dave smiled to himself as he finished with the engine. Sometimes, people underestimated the quiet ones. They assumed that because someone didn't raise their voice or put on a show, they couldn't handle themselves. But as the bikers had learned, appearances could be deceiving. Underneath the surface, there could be a hidden power that no one saw coming. Dave wasn't just a mechanic. He wasn't just the guy who fixed engines and patched up broken parts. No, he was more than that. He had experience, knowledge, and an unshakable calm. And when it came down to it, he wasn't afraid to protect what mattered most. That day, he'd shown everyone, Blade, his crew, and the town, that strength wasn't just about force. It was about doing what was right. Even when the odds seemed impossible. Even when others doubted you. Dave walked over to the small window at the back of the shop and looked out at Willow Ridge. The town was peaceful now, bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. People were finishing their work, closing up shops, heading home for the evening. It was the same as any other day, but Dave knew something had changed. The bikers had left, their engines quieter than before, their heads lower, and their pride shattered. They had underestimated Dave, just like everyone else had at some point. They thought they could come in, cause trouble, and walk away without consequences. But that wasn't the way things worked in Willow Ridge, not anymore. People who had once whispered behind his back now spoke openly with respect. They knew better now. And Dave was okay with that. He didn't need their praise. He didn't need their admiration. But it felt good to know that, in the end, his quiet strength had made a difference. It had protected the town, his shop, and the people who had trusted him. It had taken time for the town to realize it. But that's how it often is, isn't it? People are quick to judge. Quick to label someone based on what they see on the surface. But Dave had never been concerned with what others thought of him. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. What mattered was what was beneath the surface, what was inside. And inside, Dave had always known who he was. He wasn't just the quiet mechanic. He wasn't just the old man fixing cars. He was someone who could stand firm when things got tough. He was someone who could make a difference, even if it wasn't flashy or loud. Sometimes, real strength was just standing still and letting things play out. Letting the truth reveal itself in its own time. The town would remember what had happened. They would remember how Blade and his crew had tried to push their way into Dave's life. How they had tried to destroy what he had worked hard to build. But they would also remember how Dave had stood up for himself and for Willow Ridge. They would remember how he had handled everything quietly, without fanfare or need for recognition. That was how Dave had always been. And that was how he would always be. As Dave set the tools down for the evening and cleaned up his workspace, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about winning or defeating the bikers. It was about knowing he had done the right thing. He had stood his ground and taken action when it mattered most. And that, in the end, was what counted. He grabbed his jacket and walked outside, locking the door behind him. The evening air was cool, the sky now darkening as the stars began to appear. He didn't need to look back at the shop. He knew it was safe. He knew it was secure. The job had been done. As he walked down the street, people waved at him. Some called out to say hello, others gave him a nod of acknowledgement. It was the kind of quiet respect that Dave had earned over the years, respect that had always been there, but now it was louder. People understood now. They understood who he was. And that meant more to Dave than anything else. He reached the diner, where Todd was sitting at the counter, eating a sandwich. The young man looked up when he saw Dave and gave him a small grin. "You did good, Dave. Really good." Dave nodded, slipping onto the stool beside him. "Thanks, Todd. But it wasn't about being good. It was about doing what needed to be done." Todd raised an eyebrow. "Still, the way you handled those bikers, well, that was something else." Dave smiled, his eyes glinting with quiet pride. "Sometimes, people forget that strength doesn't have to be loud. You don't need to shout to make your point. You just need to be strong enough to stand your ground. And trust that the truth will speak for itself." Todd nodded slowly, absorbing Dave's words. "I get it. Sometimes, it's not about being the biggest or the toughest. It's about being the one who stays true to themselves, no matter what." Dave took a deep breath and leaned back. "Exactly. People will always try to push you, try to get you to bend. But if you know who you are, if you stay steady in your beliefs, you'll always come out on top." Todd smiled and lifted his cup of coffee. "Here's to staying steady, then." Dave clinked his cup against Todd's. "Here's to staying steady." As Dave walked out of the diner and back into the night, he knew the town would be different now. Willow Ridge had always been a quiet place, a place where people went about their lives without much drama. But now, the people of the town knew something deeper about the quiet mechanic with the steady hands and calm eyes. They knew that appearances could be deceiving. They knew that sometimes, the ones who seemed the most ordinary were the ones who held the greatest power. Dave wasn't looking for any grand recognition. He wasn't seeking fame or applause. What mattered to him was this: the lesson had been learned. And as long as he was around, Willow Ridge would always be a place where people could find peace, and where strength came in all forms, not always loud, but always steady. And in that, Dave found his peace. His work was more than just fixing engines, it was about fixing people's perceptions, too. Teaching them that respect, courage, and strength didn't come from how big you were or how loud you shouted. It came from how firmly you stood, even when the world around you was trying to knock you down. Sometimes, being quiet and steady was the greatest strength of all. And as for Dave, he was just fine with that.